Sam, when you evaluate the Bears metrically right now, with everything at your disposal, what are the range of possibilities for the quality this year? For how much of that is contingent on what we don't know about Caleb Williams as a pro?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the most important player on any NFL team is the quarterback. It's the one that moves the needle the most. And a guy like Caleb Williams, as talented as he is, feels like he fits into the category of one of the broader range of outcomes for a first year guy that you're going to find. Like he's got an incredible ability to make plays. I think his ceiling is absolutely sky high. He was getting comparisons to Mahomes, to Aaron Rodgers for a reason. You know, his tape does have that kind of special potential within it. But we also saw last year there's a downside of that, and there's a flip side, and there's a potential floor there as well. So I think a lot of what they're going to do it fits in or falls with just how good he's going to be, just how able they're going to be to get him to play within the structure of the offense more. That was the same question that Patrick Mahomes had coming into the NFL. And that's really going to, I think, determine how good this team is right away. And then you have the sort of other question marks about the team. You know, Chicago's defense last year felt like it overachieved relative to the personnel, to the individual talent.
Are you saying
Are
that
they
as a
able to
good thing or a
consistently?
good thing or a bad thing? Overachieving meaning they did better than the underlying and peripherals would suggest?
Yeah, and that's not necessarily either. You know, if they're able to consistently overachieve relative to individual talent, I mean, that's good coaching. That's good scheme. That's, you know, if it's repeatable, it's great. I mean, that's entirely a good thing. It's only a red flag if it's not repeatable and you're like, okay, that's just variance that went their way, and that's something that's going to come back down to earth the following season.
Well, Sam, I got to tell you, I'm concerned about that. And it's been one of my issues during Eberflus's tenure is that you need a three technique to make his defense go, and I don't think Ryan Poles has given him the best option at that position over the last three seasons. We'll see how Javon Dexter Sr. plays this year at the spot. But when I look at the Bears and you're saying the variance went their way last year, I'm concerned about that because when you look at the pass rush numbers on them last year, and specifically getting the quarterback on the ground last year, they struggled even with Montez Sweat. The fact that a guy could come in halfway through the season and end up being your sack leader doesn't feel good.
No, I mean it's an entirely valid concern. And Montez Sweat didn't make that one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. Montez Sweat took them from being by far the worst pass rushing team in the NFL to just in the same area as other teams again. You know, he absolutely made a huge impact, but he didn't fix the thing all by himself. And you're right also to identify, you know, Javon Dexter is maybe the key guy up front for them because it feels like they are relying on him to take a big step forward in year two and really become that second threat alongside a guy like Montez Sweat. And if he does, then it's a different conversation. Now you've got two guys wreaking havoc up front. You've got an edge rush, you've got an interior presence, and now we can start to hang a defense around that. If Dexter doesn't get any better and we're still just relying on Montez Sweat and really he doesn't have an awful lot of help up front, well, now you're into it's really challenging for a guy like Jalen Johnson to repeat the year that he had last year if you're not getting more pressure than that. It's challenging for just the rest of that defense as a whole to play at that kind of level again if you're not able to generate consistently more pressure than that.
What does your modeling say about where we stand with the relative importance and valuation of the running back position?
So the data would essentially say running backs are more a product of their environment than they are the sort of the difference in talent between any given running back, right? So if you want to fix a running game, the first thing you need to do is get a better offensive line. And then, you know, even things like how good is your passing game? These are all things that potentially move the needle more than simply drafting a first round running back, say. So it's not that the running game doesn't matter or that it's not important. It's just that the running back itself is not necessarily the way you impact that trying to fix it.
What did PFF say about the Bears linebacker play last year? How did you guys feel about it?
So I think TJ Edwards was a fantastic player for them and a fantastic addition. And that guy really is incredible story. He's almost a sort of PFF darling in terms of the guy always grades well and has had to do it the hard way. Undrafted player, preseason play, he was always good. Special teams, he was good. Earns himself a sort of role on defense, and he's good as a role player, and then eventually becomes a starter. And he's just been good every step of the way, even dating back to college. His grading was spectacular. And he's a classic guy where he's kind of limited physically. He's not a super athlete. He's not a giant, like the comparing him to Tremaine Edmonds, who is the sort of super athletic, incredibly gifted athlete. Edwards is not that guy, but he's been a phenomenal player just from a production standpoint. And then Edmonds has usually been more potential than actual production, and leaves a lot on the table for a guy that's athletically as gifted as he is. But because of that athleticism, he gets some more difficult assignments than a guy like Edwards. So it's an interesting balance. I think it's a fascinating duo that they've got between those two guys.
Similar question, Sam, to my concern about running backs. How hard should a team try to have an above replacement level or difference making center? Does that correlate to scoring? Are you a better team when you have a good center? Are you a significantly better team if you have a great center?
So I think center is a position where the real needle mover is going from problem to fine, right? And if you're fine, you don't necessarily need to go and find an all-pro superstar. You don't need to go find Jason Kelsey. It absolutely makes you better if you have a guy like that. But the big thing is just not having a liability at center, and not particularly if your center is a guy that makes line calls and makes adjustments, like the mental side of it and making sure that's on point. That's a really important thing because you can't have unblocked players, all the time. That ruins plays. But the important thing is to just not have a problem spot. And this really goes for a lot of those positions on the offensive line. We only need to get back to average. We don't need to have a superstar group, particularly relative to the investment it takes to acquire that. We just need to not have turnstiles on the offensive line.
So how close are the Bears to being okay in their choice of Coleman Shelton or Ryan Bates?
I think either one of those guys could fill that box or could check that box and be fine. I think we're about to learn this season the power of the quarterback on an offensive line and how he impacts their play. And this is it's a dynamic that I think we don't tend to pay enough attention to. Is we're always focusing on what the offensive line can do to the quarterback. We're not necessarily focusing on what the quarterback can do to the offensive line. And, you go way back, Dan Marino had like one of the greatest sack rates of all time, like barely took a sack in the entire of the 80s. And everyone's like, Miami must have had the greatest offensive line that's ever been assembled. And Miami had a good offensive line, but Dan Marino was a savant in terms of getting rid of the ball and not taking sacks. Like, he was a big part of that. And Justin Fields for the last couple of years is at the other end of the spectrum, right? That guy holds on the ball longer than anybody else in football. And yeah, there are some plays where he's going to make his offensive line look good, where they give up pressure, Fields escapes it, he bails out his left tackle. But he's holding onto the ball almost 4 seconds every single play. That's almost twice as long as somebody like Tua, who's at the other end of the spectrum. That makes an offensive line's job harder every single drop back. So 600 dropbacks in a season, every single one of those dropbacks is more difficult than it needs to be. And I think simply going from Fields to somebody else is going to make that group look better, even if they don't play any better.
Have you been able to get a good sense? Like, do you feel good in the analysis that the PFF has done in trying to figure out what Caleb is compared to some of the defenses that he ran up against, where there were moments last year where Caleb held the ball for 5 or 6 seconds because he could, because there wasn't a pass rush coming from some of the teams he was playing in the Pac-12. How do you balance that in trying to figure out a guy making the jump from college to pro and how quickly he'll process it? Is it just like looking at the better defenses like Utah, for example, and seeing what he did against them? How do you go about it?
No, it's a great point. Caleb Williams also held onto the ball a long time, and part of that sort of evaluation has got to be, well, why, right? Was that part of his game that he needed to do it, or was it simply he did it because he could, or because the dynamic at USC, like, he knew he needed to put up 40 points or they weren't winning the game, right? And that's not necessarily the case in the NFL, where you have some trust in your defense. You're not going to be in a shootout every single week. And I think one of the things you can do is go back and look at his play in rhythm, right? Just limit the tape you're watching to what happens when he plays the game in rhythm. And is he able to process? Is it working through a progression, or is it simply the first read every time? And I think Caleb Williams in rhythm is actually really good. And some of the plays he was making, we're talking, he drops back, he goes through a progression, and he gets rid of the ball, all within rhythm, and all in a pretty good time frame. And then you get those plays where he does hold on to the ball and start playing hero ball. And I think as long as you can look at that and say, okay, if we scale up the frequency of those in rhythm plays, and we simply say, look, have a bit more trust in everybody around you, play within the structure a bit more. And then, when it breaks down on 3rd and 10, go be the hero, go be Patrick Mahomes on that play. I think you can get Caleb Williams to look a lot more like a conventional NFL quarterback than certainly Fields has been over the last couple of years.